Hello, I'm Dennis Pravinsky and welcome to Grandpa Dennis's Woodturning Studio. Today it's all about my lathe. It's a custom lathe that I designed and had built for me. So let's get started. I'm going to go through all of the features on my lathe and try and do it as much detail as I can. And then stay tuned for the conclusion. I'm not doing this video to brag about what I've accomplished, what I've designed, and what I've built. I'm here to explain details about what my lathe can do and how I built it and why I built it as well. I started this process in 1991. I had an old General lathe and I wasn't that pleased with it. I had only been turning for a few years, but really enjoyed it and wanted to get into it as a specialty. I researched what was available on the market and couldn't find anything that had a good, half-decent motor with a variable speed to it. I wanted to turn pieces that were very large, but I had a small amount of space to work with it. The research and development and manufacturing of this lathe took 3 or 4 years. I found a welder who was able to weld the entire body of the lathe and all the pieces. My neighbor owned a machine shop and he did all the milling. I'm going to start off the tour talking about the inverter, or the computer that manages all the electronics on my lathe. This is a Toshiba brand. This is the 1-inch thick Toshiba manual. That's basically what it looks like. No, that's not the inverter. The inverter is behind that picture in a dust-proof case. That light bulb tells me that the inverter is on. Here are my switches. This one shuts the computer off. This one turns it on again. The reason for that light bulb is pretty basic. The inverter is now on, but I cannot hear it. My fear is I'll finish my wood turning session, go in the house, and that inverter will be on for all night, maybe even days or weeks. However, with the light bulb on, when I am leaving my studio, I can see that the inverter is still on. Then I can come back to the lathe and turn it off. All of the wiring for this is encased in conduit that's dustproof and waterproof. There's my 220 power that goes into the inverter, and it comes out and goes into the motor. The motor on my lathe is a 5 horsepower, 3-phase motor. It's got step pulleys attached to the motor, corresponding step pulleys attached to a jack shaft, and then corresponding step pulleys attached to the spindle. The jack shaft and all the pulleys was I wanted to ensure that I could turn the spindle at 25 RPM for hours without overheating the motor. So with the series of pulleys that I have, I can have the lathe running at 25 RPM and the motor at 250 RPM. That way the fan on the motor will continue to cool it. I was told that when you put an inverter onto a 3-phase motor, you reduce the horsepower by 1/3. I wanted a 3 horsepower motor on my lathe, so I went with the 5 horsepower, which then was supposed to equal 3. Doing the research and finding these pulleys was quite a chore. The kicker is, I never use them. I keep it at this setting all the time, and it works. So all that work basically for nothing. Continuing with the wiring, I have the wiring coming in from the inverter on a 25-foot cable. That's so that I can move my lathe to the center of my garage and do work there if I wanted to. The kicker on this is that I've never moved my lathe in 30 years. This is the wiring coming out of the inverter, and it goes into this pipe. And that pipe is attached to the back of the lathe, and it goes all the way into the control panel. This is the switch for ramping up and down. This is the switch for forward, off, reverse. This is the rheostat for off, on, and variable speed. The panel up here lets you do all the really neat and interesting things that can happen with the inverter. However, I never use it, except when the computer trips and I have to reset it. This gives me the RPMs that the lathe is running at. However, as you can see, I have a lot of difficulty reading that and seeing it, and I never use it either. The ramp up and ramp down is an interesting feature. Basically, it is there to safeguard your lathe and the piece you're working on. If you've got a piece that's got a large diameter or a lot of weight, it builds up centrifugal force when it's turning. If the lathe shuts down very quickly, the centrifugal force will trip the computer and or keep moving and possibly unwind the piece from the spindle, and it goes flying. So, on this setting, the lathe will turn on quickly to full speed and will shut off completely quite quickly. On that setting, the lathe will pick up speed gradually and will slow down gradually. That will allow you to keep the computer from tripping. Very good feature that I think is on most of the lathes these days. Control center not only swivels up here, but it also moves to the back position, and I can swivel this around. So it's now accessible to me here. This is a handy feature if I want to be able to use my control center in various positions. However, I seldom move it. It usually just stays right here over the center of my lathe. This is my on-off switch that is wired directly to the control center that I just reviewed. Again, it's got a dust-proof and waterproofed sheeting around the very thin wire that goes into this switch. This basically is a light switch for an old truck. For those of you that can remember this, back in the day when you wanted to turn the brights on in your truck, there was a button on the floor that you hit with your foot, and it turned the brights on and off. Well, that's my on-off switch. This is not according to code. because you can bang against it and turn your machine on. Nowadays, all of the switches have a protective sleeve around here to keep you from turning it on by banging it. This becomes extremely useful for me. I can stand next to the switch with my thigh, turn it on and off just like that. That becomes very handy for me. I can have my tools set up, as an example, inside a hollow form, holding on to the tool, and just with my hip, I can turn on the machine or shut it off if needed. Which is on some pretty heavy-duty magnets, and I can position it anywhere along the lathe, including back at this side when I'm working on the back end of a piece. This is the general shape of the lathe from the bed all the way to the body. You can see how it comes down on an angle and then across at the bottom, straight up. The base of the lathe is considerably bigger than the body of it. There's my movable bed. The front part of the lathe. This is my indexing wheel. It's also the locking system for the lathe. This lever will engage and lock. Then I can take my faceplates and my chucks off the lathe with a special wrench. This is an interesting concept here. That's a dead man switch. With the locking lever in position, locking the spindle, this switch is not engaged and the power is not going through to my on-off switch. Now the switch is engaged and there's power going through to the switch. This prevents me from accidentally turning on the lathe while the spindle is locked. In my first lathe, I did that 3 times before I really started to learn. And boy, did that ever smoke the belts. This is my hand wheel. That's handy. And at this end is the Morris 2 taper. The machine shop got a Morris 2 sleeve, drilled the hole, and welded the sleeve on, so that's a perfect Morris 2 taper. They didn't have to mill it out. The hole in the shaft is drilled all the way through to the other end. The distance from the top of my bed to the center of the spindle is 13 inches. So I can turn a piece 26 inches in diameter in this position. However, I've got bolts going through the bed that I can loosen up and move this bed in that direction up to about here. That gives me a gap from that bed to here of 19.5 inches. So I can turn a piece that can rotate all the way around here, 19.5 inches times 2, which is 2 times, carry the 1 over, well, a lot. Now, you can imagine a 38-inch piece rotating around here. How do I get to the back end to true it up on the back? Well, that's where these come in. So the machine shop has made another bed for me that bolts onto here and comes out to about there. I can put my tool rest on that and turn the back of a large piece. I've used that once. What about getting a tool rest to come out to this position on a large piece? That's where these come in. I've had the machine shop also make me another bed that comes out here with a plate on it and bolts that go through that I can tighten at the other end. Then I've got another right-angled bed that I can put my tool rest on to extend it further out. I've used that only once. This double bed system has worked very well. I have often loosened the bolts all the way through and pulled it out to extend my distance between centers. In this configuration, I do not have a lot of room. 12 inches, 14 inches between centers in here. On many occasions, I've had to loosen the bolts on this bed and pull the entire bed out to give me more distance in here. The reason I've made a lathe this short is because my intention has always been to just be a bowl turner. I'm not interested in long pieces. However, there were many times when this distance was too short. For example, turning handles for tools. So I've had to loosen the bolts up and move the bed further out. The question comes, why would you go through all this trouble for a lathe that is so short? Well, basically because all I wanted to do was turn bowls. If I had to turn a longer piece, I have a general mini lathe that with an extension that I can turn a 4-foot piece. It's not heavy duty, but if you're turning just a spindle, you don't need that much strength. The entire lathe is made with 3/8 inch steel plate welded together. I have a cap at the bottom and one at the top at the back of the lathe. I've unscrewed that cap and put into the body of the lathe about 300 pounds of sand. When I was designing and building this lathe, steel at that time was approximately $1 a pound. I have $1,600 worth of steel in this lathe. That means the lathe weighs 1,600 pounds plus the weight of the sand. The beds are made up of 6x6 steel beams cut down the center, and then the plate steel is welded on to act as the bed of the lathe. I've also braced it in a number of spots along with rods going through the bed to brace it, because once I split open the beam, there wasn't much strength in there. For my tool rests is from one way, and I've got the larger one because of the extra height on my spindle. This is probably one of the best on the market. The machine shop made this apparatus for me. It screws into my spindle that's been threaded, and that is actually my vacuum hose that goes to the vacuum pump. Now my spindle can rotate while this remains stationary and has a airtight seal in there. This hose goes to the back of this cylinder and connects here to that cylinder. This hose is connected to my vacuum pump. It's up in the cupboard above my lathe. So vacuum is drawn through this hose into that cylinder. The vacuum then comes out to the back and goes to my spindle. In the cupboard behind my lathe is a vacuum pump. This switch turns on the vacuum pump as well as that light, which again reminds me that the vacuum is on. This valve releases the vacuum from the whole system. The pump is still on, but the vacuum is drawn out of here. With that closed, now the whole system is sealed and the vacuum is sucking down here on the front of the spindle. Now for the tailstock. The machine shop made this for me after they completed the whole lathe. I've got a couple of handles on here. This is 3/4 inch steel plate. This is all 1/4 inch steel. This has a travel of 6.5 inches. With that kind of travel, the question comes, how accurate is it? When I measured everything on the lathe, I'm within 3 thou of being absolutely perfect. This is the locking mechanism for this spindle. One thing the machine shop did wrong when they made it is they have the threads in here backwards. This took a little bit of getting used to for me, but I'm coping with it. Bearings are in here and in here. This is the locking mechanism. There's a rubber gasket in there to prevent dust from getting in. Most people, when they set this up on their lathe, they will lock the spindle in place. I've never locked it. Everything is milled so precise in there that there's no play in there and it never comes out and loosens. One last thing about the tailstock. I had asked the machine shop to do a Morris 3 taper in here instead of a Morris 2. I thought that that would give me more substance and a little more strength. Most of the accessories will come in a Morris 2 or Morris 3. However, it's a little more difficult to find drill chucks that are in a Morris 3 taper. And when you do, they're relatively expensive. This is a Morris 3 drill chuck. It's substantial, a lot of weight to it. However, this particular drill chuck is about $500 retail. Fortunately, a friend of mine who owns a machine shop gave me this, but without the key. The key for this was $35 just for the key. So when you go upgrade into more substantial stuff, you're paying a premium. This is the locking system for my tailstock. As with most tailstocks, the shaft in here is off-centered so that it pulls up on the bolt that's attached in the ways of the bed. This system is not just an eye bolt, it's actually a bearing in there. That's overkill, but the machine shop did it for me. This tailstock weighs approximately 50 pounds. For me to take it on and off and put it down on the ground, lift it up, it's just too much. At 74 years of age, I've had enough of that physical stuff. I've bolted an eye bolt onto this. I have an electric hoist on the ceiling. That's the extent of my lifting. It's out of the way. When I want to bring it back down and use it, that's the extent of my lifting. Next feature I want to show you is this bolt. It goes through the foot of the lathe, and I screw it down to make the bolt go into that piece of wood that's flat on the cement floor. That allows me to level the entire lathe by adjusting these 4 bolts, one on each corner. If I undo the bolts, it settles the whole lathe onto casters that are on each corner. And each caster can take 1,000 pounds. So I undo the bolts, lower the lathe onto the casters, and then I can move it around. I have used the casters once to move the lathe about a foot to the right. My conclusion to this video is quite simple. Unless you're very, very wealthy, don't build your own lathe. This lathe ended up costing me 3 or 4 times what I could have purchased one for. This is almost impossible to build today because of the labor costs for a machine shop. However, if you own a machine shop, or if you're a machinist yourself, this maybe is doable. So I've got a deal for you. If you're interested in making your own lathe, give me an email and we can open a discussion on that. I can tell you some of the pitfalls I went through and also some of the things that I would do differently. In fact, we can even set up a meeting right in my studio. So here are the things that I would have done differently. Number 1, I would have extended the bed a little bit more. Maybe another 6 inches or so. That comes in handy when I'm doing large turnings that I need a steady rest on and have either a coring system or have a hollowing system in there. However, I've been able to slide this bed quite easily and I've been able to manage. So it's not a real drawback. Another issue is I could have put a groove just past the threads in the spindle. That way I could have gotten a set screw put into my faceplates to go in that groove, preventing the faceplate from coming off when I reverse turn. However, the only advantage to reverse turning I could see would be for sanding. I've never had to use it. I've never thought I would need it. So it's not that big a drawback. Another issue is the whining noise in the motor. I think most of the 3-phase motors with inverters have a bit of that whining noise. This one has considerably more. I think that's because it's a 5-horsepower motor. I've gotten used to it, so it's not a deal breaker. The last thing that I haven't gotten used to is shavings going inside the bed. Because this is a square tube, there's nowhere for the shavings to go. So they pile up in there. The only way I found to get them out is with a vacuum. But if the shavings are large, the vacuum gets clogged up. I have yet to come up with a solution for that, and this is annoying. This lathe is now 30 years old, and I've used it quite a bit over that 30 years. I've done no maintenance on it. Nothing has broken on it. It works just as well as it did the first day. The only maintenance I've done on this is to put some grease into the pillow blocks. And I think I've only done that 3 or 4 times in 30 years. Nothing is broken down on it. No other maintenance is needed. No other adjustments were needed. If you enjoyed this video, I'd ask you to subscribe to it, and thank those that have subscribed already. If you know of any wood turners that'd be interested in this video, please share it with them. That's a good way for me to grow my channel. Until the next time, keep on turning.
Grandpa Dennis is turning.
I'm alright, 'cause I'm okay. Doesn't matter if my beard is gray. Just listen, I have something to say.
Grandpa Dennis is turning.
I'm alright, 'cause I'm okay. And this old goat has something to say. So just keep learning, for Grandpa Dennis is turning.